Welcome to this online webinar on the history of Russia and Ukraine, which is going to reflect on the historical context for the current war. My name is Liz Friend-Smith, one of the history editors at Cambridge University Press. It is my very great pleasure to be introducing our speakers today, and I am enormously looking forward to what I'm sure will be a fascinating conversation. I'm just going to introduce all of our speakers briefly before I hand over to our moderator, Hiroaki Kuromiya, who is going to be directing the event. So in alphabetical order, first, Jonathan Brunstedt is an assistant professor of history at Texas A&M University. His research centers on nationalism, memory, and ideology in the Soviet Union and the wider world, with a special emphasis on the representation and commemoration of war. He is the author, most recently, of The Soviet Myth of World War II, Patriotic Memory and the Russian Question in the USSR, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. The book uses Soviet remembrance of World War II as a lens to examine, among other things, how a socialist society reconciled itself to the seemingly un-Marxist notions of patriotism, homeland, Russian ethnocentrism, and the glorification of war. Brunstedt's current project, supported in part by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, focuses on the use of historical analogies and their role in framing the ideological conflict of the late Cold War. Nikolay Koposov is a Russian historian currently teaching at Emory University, having previously worked at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and Johns Hopkins University. He was founding dean of Russia's first and only state liberal arts college, Smolny College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, a joint venture of St. Petersburg State University and Bard College, New York. His research deals with various aspects of modern historiography and historical memory, from early modern France to post-Soviet Russia. His publications include How Historians Think, 2001, and Memory Laws, Memory Wars, The Politics of the Past in Europe and Russia, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. Filip Slaveski is lecturer in Russian, Soviet, and East European history at the Australian National University. His works focus on conflict and its aftermath, especially the intersections of hunger, mass violence, and political repression in the former Soviet space. These include Stalin's liquidation game, the unlikely case of Alexander Shumsky, the Soviet occupation of Germany, hunger, mass violence, and the struggle for peace, 1945 to 1947, published by Cambridge University Press in 2013, and most recently, Remaking Ukraine after World War II, The Clash of Local and Central Soviet Power, published in 2021, also by Cambridge. Filip is currently lead chief investigator on the Australian Research Council, ARC, Discovery Project, The Last Soviet Famine, 1946 to 1947. Finally, our moderator, Hiroaki Kuromiya. Hiroaki is the author of Freedom and Terror in the Donbass, a Ukrainian-Russian borderlands, 1870s to 1990s, published by Cambridge University Press in 1998, The Voices of the Dead, Stalin's Great Terror in the 1930s, 2007, among other books. He taught Ukrainian, Russian, and Soviet history at Indiana University until 2021. So I am very much looking forward to hearing our speakers talk and to what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation about the issues this conflict raises. So without further ado, over to you, Hiroaki.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Hiroaki Kuromiya, the moderator of today's discussion. Today's topic is extremely topical for obvious reasons, because we all know that war is going on between Ukraine and Russia. Now we have three specialists whose work, I think, is very relevant to the war. We'd like to understand the war better and have a discussion with our audience about our views. So I'd like to pose this general question to all of you, all three speakers today. The first is, how relevant is your work to the war Russia unleashed against Ukraine in late February? What historical factors may explain Russia's invasion of Ukraine under the slogan of demilitarization and denazification? What specific historical and political factors, such as myth-making, politics of commemoration, the national memories of the past, the lingering past, may account for Russia's war against Ukraine? Perhaps we'll go more or less periodically, starting with Professor Slaveski, then Professor Brunstedt, sorry, and Professor Posokov. Professor Slaveski, please.
Thanks, Hiroaki. I see the current invasion, and I sort of mark the current invasion more from 2014 than 50 or 60 days ago, as the latest manifestation of a long history of Russian and Soviet intervention in Ukraine. The roots of this history, the roots of this type of intervention go back a very long way in the history of this place. I pick it up mostly from the 20th century in my works, and I approach it from my three main directions. The first direction is sort of the history of the birth of the Soviet republics, including Russia and Ukraine in the Soviet Union in the 20s. I just finished a book with our colleague Yuri Shapoval in Ukraine, tracing the birth of Ukraine, the beginnings of Soviet policies in the various republics in the Soviet Union to help sort of build them up and create them. And then in the 1930s, the reversal of that policy that eliminated independence in these republics as part of a massive purge and violence that killed millions of people. The other direction which I approach this is understanding Ukraine and its relationship with Russia and the Soviet Union in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, where Ukraine had been absolutely devastated by war and German occupation. It had lost millions of its citizens and was absolutely destroyed in terms of its infrastructure. I look at its rebuilding, and in that rebuilding phase, we see too the types of relationships, concerns among Russian, particularly Russian and Soviet leaders about concerns that we saw in the 1920s and 30s. They are primarily the concerns that Ukraine can be a dangerous place. It can be a place where the marriage of Ukrainian nationalism and Western intervention can spell doom for the Soviet Union or for Russia. That was an enduring concern in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and even after the Second World War in the 1940s. And I would trace, I guess, the contemporary interventions in Ukraine by the Russian state very much in this deep historical understanding of Ukraine as a potentially dangerous place for Russia. As a place that is potentially dangerous, but that is absolutely inextricably linked to a Russian destiny, Soviet destiny, the idea that there can be no great Russia without its little Russia being in Ukraine. Now, this is a very simple, general understanding, but it's one that I'm offering as a framework for helping to, I guess, situate so much of our other work. Particularly, I know Jonathan and Nikolay have operated in this space as well. The third direction would be of the mass famine, or the famines that occurred primarily in Ukraine, but also in other places throughout the 20th century. The ones that I look at, 1946 and 1947, very much like the earlier mass famines of 1932 and 1933, were a result of a combination of factors, including successive bad weather, but also government response policies, collectivization policies, and the reconstruction of the agricultural sector after the Second World War. And even within these policies, I think there is a degree to which this understanding of dealing with Ukraine as an integral part of the broader Russian and Soviet project, but as a potentially dangerous place that can be lost to the marriage of Western intervention and Ukrainian nationalism is certainly evident. And I'll probably end on that last point of Ukrainian nationalism, which the Russian regime is very fond of using. I should say that even from the 1920s, this term had been used by Soviet leaders, primarily Russian Soviet leaders, but also Ukrainian leaders who were allied to Russia, as a way of conceptualizing any form of support for Ukrainian independence and sovereignty that did not fall within an acceptable bounds for the leadership. And in the 20s, the derogatory terms for nationalists were usually concerned with those Western countries that were feared to have influence in Ukraine, particularly Poland. But then in the 1930s, this moved to Germany with fascism, and in the 1940s and so forth. So that elastic term, which is used so much now in a derogatory sense, is not new. It's very old, has deep roots, much like the relationship that we're witnessing. There are so many other factors that I haven't covered, particularly Russia's concerns after the collapse of the Soviet Union with NATO expansion, with a range of other geopolitical factors that are very important. I haven't touched on myth and memory making as much as Jonathan and Nikolay might, but I'm offering this as a potential framework for understanding some of our work.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Brunstedt.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say I really enjoyed reading the work of Nikolay and Filip, and of course your own Hiroaki. It's been really illuminating to me. So regarding the question of relevance, I'm biased, of course, but I think all three of our these books really offer some insight into understanding the conflict that's unfolding today. I'll say for my own projects, the most obvious place where I think it provides a lot of historical context is in the World War II rhetoric that's fairly ubiquitous in this conflict, as Filip said, not just recently, but since 2014, at least. So talk about Nazis, denazification, fascism, and all of this stuff. And I think what my book does, it provides historical context in three particular areas that I think all have their origins in Soviet era myth making. So the first would be domestic, so how the war's messaging functions at a domestic level among Russians. The second would be geopolitical or international, the way the war's memory is being deployed as an anti-Western cudgel or instrument. And the third would be regarding the specific relationship between Russia and Ukraine in particular. So I'll just briefly touch on these. Domestically speaking, I think it's fairly known. Probably a lot of people who are going to watch this recognize that the large-scale veneration of World War II in the Soviet Union actually dates from around the 1960s. And I think the argument has long been that this is mainly about political legitimation for the aging gerontocratic Communist Party leadership at that time. That's partly true. One of the things I've uncovered in my own research in my book is the war's appeal because, from the leadership's perspective, because it was able to reconcile competing notions of patriotism and patriotic identity in the Soviet Union. So up until the early 1960s, you have competing ideas about, was it the Russians that led the World War II victory? What was the role of other Soviet peoples in this? And so there were these kind of Russocentric narratives and also this sort of wider multinational, more inclusive narrative of the war and of Soviet patriotism more generally. One of the reasons the war was so important and its veneration really magnified in the 1960s was because debates about Soviet patriotism really came to a head at precisely that time. Is this a sort of Russian-dominated society? Is our historical memory centered on ideas of Russian leadership in the past, or is there a more socialist, inclusive narrative of the war of patriotism that we can promote? And the war's veneration actually had the effect of reconciling these things. It was multinational. It was inclusive, but it also didn't upset Russians or people who held to a kind of Russocentric idea of Soviet patriotic identity, because implicitly they could read into it that this was a Russian-led event, although that was not what the dominant narrative was all about. So what I see happening today is, or actually in the 21st century at least, Putin's use of the war, which has its own long history. Well, part of the reason it's so attractive is because the war myth, like few other historical memories in today's Russia, has the ability to cut through deep ethnic economic, social, and even to some extent political divides in Russian society. So I would say this adaptability of the war myth for this really dates to the Soviet era. The second is the geopolitical international aspects of it. You know, when the Soviet war myth began to develop in the 1940s, and especially in the late 1940s, as Cold War tensions began escalating, the Soviet formation of this myth was in conscious dialogue with Western war myths that were developing at that time too, that had a similar sort of Cold War valence to them. So in the West, for example, World War II was in the late 1940s, was recast as a fight between democracy and totalitarianism, right? This is a sort of Western narrative of the war. And you can see how this could be a tool of the Cold War. It essentially equated Nazism, Hitler, with Stalinism, and later the Soviet Union. So World War II celebrations in the West could be implicitly an anti-Soviet, have an anti-Soviet message to it, right? Which is not very, grounded in historical context. It was unmoored from this. Well, when the Soviets, of course, recognized this, they recast World War II along the lines of fascism versus anti-fascism, right? So the ultimate expression of anti-fascism was Soviet communism. And of course, they could point to the fact that the Soviets played the predominant role in the defeat of Hitler and so on. Of course, who were the fascists? Well, fascism, according to Soviet ideology, is this manifestation of extreme capitalist imperialism. So during the Cold War as well, the Soviets, the communist bloc, was able to use World War II in an anti-Western sense. And so again, in both cases, they're sort of unmoored from historical context and reality, and it became this kind of myth you could deploy against another. And in the Soviet case, it was in an anti-Western direction. So looking at Putin talking about denazification and these things that sound really crazy, this has a long history because dating from precisely the Cold War use of the war, pointing to the West as, if there's going to be a new fascism, a new Hitler that arises, it's obviously going to come from this capitalist imperialist superpower, the United States or the West. So you see this rhetoric about fascism, Nazism applied to the West, which it seems strange given the actual history of World War II. That matters less. This became an anti-Western sort of cudgel or narrative. And all in the context of the Cold War, of course. The final point, I think, where my work is relevant regarding the World War II rhetoric, it regards Russia and Ukraine in particular, that particular relationship. And one of the interesting things I found in my own research was that Ukraine played a very central role in the development of the larger Soviet myth of World War II, this victory myth. What happened was in the early 1960s, when there were real efforts after de-Stalinization sort of stabilized a bit, there were efforts to rewrite the history of World War II in an official capacity. Up to that point, the official history of the war had been a collection of Stalin's public statements and correspondences known as On the Great Patriotic War. It wasn't until the late 1950s that they proposed we need to update this with a non-Stalinist text. So they began writing the official history of the Great Patriotic War, and in 1965, the 6-volume history was published. Well, what I found in the debates of the editorial board was that in one of the first volumes after it was published, there was a photograph there that depicted Ukrainians. The caption of the photograph depicted all Ukrainians as collaborators. And this caused an uproar within the editorial board, who was fielding all these angry letters from Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian patriots, who said, why are you branding us all Nazi collaborators and so on? It sparked a real heated debate inside the political leadership, but in particular in this editorial board for the official history of the war. And they decided that, actually they have a point there. We need to fix this. And so it was decided that in the subsequent volumes, and especially the most important 6th volume of this history, which outlined the reasons for the victory officially, they argued for a pan-Soviet inclusive memory of the war. And they actually stripped out important Russo-centric statements of Stalin and so on in order to achieve that. But this all has its origin in Ukrainian protest against the way they're being depicted. And that's just one example, but there are many others. But what I will say about the Soviet myth is that it always depicted Ukrainians and Russians as distinct national communities, as distinct peoples. Of course, they shared an identity. That identity was Soviet, right? But both Russian and Ukrainian identities fell below that larger umbrella Soviet identity. This is, of course, very different from what we see today. There was no effort in the Soviet war myth to portray Ukrainians or to try to assimilate them into the Russian nation. So I think that's an important distinction between the war myth of the Soviet era and what's happening today. But I would argue that Ukraine, its special place in Russian war memory, that also really dates to the Soviet era.
Thank you. Professor Koposov, please.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, actually, my work is a sort of immediate prehistory of the current war in Ukraine, because I studied the politics of history in Russia, Ukraine, and several other European countries. And I begin in the 1980s or so, and go more or less until the present day. And I am absolutely sure that the analysis of those memory wars between Putin's Russia and its East European neighbors are the main explanation. Those memory wars are the main explanations, the most important factor that we have to take into account to understand the current tragic events happening in Ukraine, the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Basically, many people try to understand what are the objective, so to say, reasons, what were the objective reasons for Putin to start this war. And I read some of those texts, some of those analyses, as all of us have done, I guess, and I have found no satisfactory answer. I'm pretty much convinced that there are no serious reasons for Putin's aggression against Ukraine. It's a war which is all explained by ideology, and since Putin's ideology is basically a certain kind of historical memory, it's a historical narrative centered on the so-called Great Patriotic War, or actually the Russian-German War of 1941-1945. Since Putin's ideology is basically this narrative, then one can conclude that the Russian aggression against Ukraine has historical battles over the past as its immediate cause, immediate origins. And this goes somehow against a deeply rooted conviction that most of us have, that serious historical events must have serious objective causes. That if there is a revolution, there should be a long-standing class conflict or whatever. If there is, a war, there should be sort of economic competition, or once again, something very material, very serious, because otherwise no responsible politician would decide to start a war. And I'm afraid that this kind of general framework in which we tend to consider wars is not necessarily something which corresponds to how history actually works. I'm afraid that many wars, maybe even most wars, have been caused by ideologies, emotions, fears, insecurities, myths, whatever. And Putin's aggression is a classical example of this kind of more general tendency. Putin's aggression against Ukraine is a continuation of his memory politics, and the war that he has been fighting against Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic countries, the Czech Republic, against the entire world, actually, at least against most of Russia's former satellites, once again, over the interpretation of the past. And although theoretically, according to the Russian constitution, Russia has no state or obligatory ideology, in fact, Russia has such ideology. And this ideology, this war narrative, which from my perspective explains the war. And Putin began playing actually the card of historical memory from his day one in the office. And since then, the cult of the war has become really, under him, the founding myth of post-Soviet Russia. And it's interesting, Jonathan, what you said, I like very much your book as well as the books of all other participants of this current, meeting. It's interesting what you said again about, the fact that under the Soviets, the Great Patriotic War was used to promote not so much, perhaps, even Russian identity, but rather a more general Soviet identity, an umbrella identity. As you said, now it is no longer the case, of course. Now the Putin, the myth of the war, which Putin once again has promoted to the place of Russia's official ideology, is a very exclusivist Russian myth, and all other peoples, or almost all other peoples, in this myth appear as Nazi allies or some kind of bad guys in any event. And of course, what the Soviets never dared to say publicly, openly about against Ukrainians, but what many of them had in mind, this is now being said publicly, openly, and those, rather most invented, offenses or invented traumas or whatever you call them, which hark back to the 1940s and 1950s, they have now been transformed into a very powerful historical force, a force which is far more powerful than you can imagine that. And to finish my short statement, I've never been involved in politics. Politics is not really my sphere, but I have, of course, as most of us do, of course, friends who are in politics. And those friends have been telling me from, once again, the early 2000s, that Putin, that he's not only a very evil kind of person, but that he really hates the West, that this is his dominant emotions, and that he's a man who is driven by emotions. And I'm afraid that these emotions, this anti-Western, anti-Ukrainian, anti-Polish, anti-Baltic countries, the entire world, hatred, which somehow manifests itself in Putin's war mythology, is the main driving force of his politics. And strangely enough, even those like myself or many others whose work was focused on Putin's politics of memory, very few of us could really foretell that the outcome of this hatred would be a real war. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I wonder if three of you want to pose questions to each other, because in a sense we agree, in a sense we may not agree. In some ways, Professor Slaveski's argument may suggest probably this is inevitable. I mean, the war was inevitable because there was a great deal of, conflict or disagreement between Ukraine and Russia, dating back at least to the 1920s. And then Professor Brunstedt's argument is, well, at least until 1991 or so, Russians even agreed that Russia and Ukraine are distinct countries. On the other hand, this memory of differences between emphasizing Russia's contribution to the West and Soviet Union as a whole's contribution to the war victory. There might have been some kind of conflict there, because emphasizing all union effort may be just a cover for emphasizing more Russia's effort. And Professor Koposov's argument, sure, there is no inevitability in history, perhaps, but here, in this case, ideology, Putin's use of ideology, Putin's use of history made it really inevitable for Russia to fight against the Soviet Union. It's tricky to discuss whether something is inevitable or not, but I wonder if some of you have any comments or questions to each other.
Thanks, Hiro. Maybe I can ask a question to Jonathan and to Nikolay. I don't know about inevitability either. I think where I'm coming from is that the current invasion, it's not necessarily something new or out of the blue. And in some ways, although Putin's a central player, I don't see him as, I see him continuing a long tradition rather than creating a new one. And when it comes to intervening in Ukraine in the way that he's done, if we go back to the 1920s, the discussions among the leadership, the Soviet, predominantly Russian leadership, concerns Ukraine as a base for Western intervention against the new Soviet Union. If we go to the 30s and 40s, it's a similar argument concerning first German and then in the Cold War, Western intervention as a base for which can undermine Soviet security, which is very much the political and geopolitical argument being made now by the regime with regard to sort of Cold War, NATO expansion and so forth. So none of that's new, and I think it's deeply rooted. So yes, memory laws and these things are very important. I don't know if they're the only thing. I think that there are a range of other factors that are quite deep and quite resonant at the moment. For Jonathan, it's funny because I wrote a book on Alexander Shumsky recently, who was the Soviet Commissar for Education in the 1920s in Ukraine, who Stalin had assassinated quite dramatically in 1946 after having him arrested and detained for over a decade. Shumsky wrote to Stalin before he tried to commit suicide in 1945, incandescent at Stalin's veneration of the Russian people as the main contributor to victory in World War II in one of his famous toasts, his speeches in victory in 1945. And not many people know this, but later on in October of the same year, Nikita Khrushchev continued this type of veneration of ethnic Russians as the leading force in the Soviet Union in a radio address in Ukraine. If I could read you Shumsky's response very quickly, and I think this will be interesting for us to understand. He wrote to Stalin in ways that no one else did, which probably accounts partly for the reason he was assassinated. He wrote to Stalin in October 1945, he said, "Your own speech are quite full of compliments to the Russian people and segregation of the peoples of the Soviet Union by their intelligence and strength of character already set a dangerous precedent to which Nikita Khrushchev, in his Little Russian lyrical ecstasy, has applied to Ukraine." Little Russians like Khrushchev always drone on about the great help that the older Russian brother gives to the little Ukrainian one, for the Russians' clear mind, strong character, and iron will. What is the worth of a nation on whose behalf this thanks is given? This is a policy of national political castration, which turns Ukraine into an amorphous body, into Little Russia, Malorossiya, end quote. And I think Shumsky was onto something in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, because he recognized this veneration of one ethnicity at the expense of another as continuing the tropes of the 1920s and the 1930s, where, particularly under Stalin, this type of hierarchy in the Soviet Union was dominant. And particularly after the Second World War, it's interesting, Jonathan, you talk about this unity. My understandings, particularly as we go into the 50s and 60s, is the deep undercurrents of concern about Ukraine and its mass collaborations with the Germans, which you talked about. And even though the myth lays on top of that afterwards as a unifying one among all Soviet nations, which I think you're right, that simmering understanding of Ukraine as a site of Western collaboration with fascism continues. And when Putin, and not only Putin, but the leadership speak about fascism today, there's that deep historical reference, and unfair and I think grossly inaccurate reference, but nonetheless something that's quite resonant, that this is a place that's untrustworthy and that acts as a potential site for undermining Soviet, now Russian security. And for me, those historical resonances are very important. They sort of underlay so much of the contemporary rhetoric about what's being spoken about in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, so I'll just take over that. Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, I was glad that you had that quote handy. The Shumsky is just a fascinating figure. I'll say so. to draw a straight line from so first of all, let me say during the war, immediately after the war, there was this highly Russocentric narrative. Think about the speeches that Stalin made during the war itself. In November 1941, he invoked Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Kutuzov, and so on. I mean, Soviet propaganda during the war, used figures from the distant Russian past as part of its mobilizational efforts in the 1930s. As you said, this was also, as David Brandenburger's argued, that in the late 1930s in particular, there was this resurrection of these pre-revolutionary heroes and so on, in part to give the Soviet Union a usable past. Because in the aftermath of the terror, it had kind of decimated the old Bolshevik ranks, and that the revolution wasn't having the same sort of appeal. And so how do we mobilize a society along patriotic lines? Well, then 1945 happens, victory happens. And in May, so what I would say is it's not really a straight line. It's more a bunch of zigzags, going from this period to the, say, post-Soviet period. So part of these zigzags, Stalin gives this toast on May 24th, 1945. I should say my book has a whole chapter called Stalin's Toast that looks at it. And your quote from Shumsky there is important because it shows that not everybody in the Soviet Union embraced this toast, right? Which was, has been interpreted as being extremely popular and as having a defining the war myth for the subsequent, 40 years or so. So what I try to do with my book is show that it's more complicated than that. Stalin's toast did not appeal to everybody, and I sort of show there's records of factory managers reporting some of their workers because they're complaining about Stalin's toast. On the other hand, some Russian soldiers, veterans, many Russians loved the toast. So the point is, it was received in quite varied terms. What you have, though, and you're right to point out Khrushchev, right, later that year. Following this line, you have Popov, the head of the Moscow Communist Party, mayor of Moscow, and so on, also embracing this line in 1945-46. Then what do you have? Stalin's toast disappears from the Soviet press from 1947 on. Right until 1943, there was 1953, right before Stalin's death, it was brought back. So it disappears as a major theme. Not coincidentally, in 1947 sees all these celebrations of Russian historical events, the founding of Moscow, a Pushkin celebration, and things like this. What I try to show in this chapter, at least, is that Russocentrism associated with the war was kind of compartmentalized during these years. It was a gradual process, right? Never complete, at least until after Stalin's death. But he tried to focus Russian interest on Russian history and Russian centrality on pre-revolutionary subjects, historical preservation, medieval Russian knights, and so on. But also the revolution kind of became Russified as well. Early Soviet developments, narratives became Russified. As well. The war was this alternative that even in Stalin's time, you see kind of splitting off from this larger Russocentric narrative, because Stalin's toast and the Russocentric version of the war had limited appeal, not just beyond the borders of the Russian Federation within the Soviet Union, but abroad. As the Cold War develops and heats up, guess what the West is saying about the Soviet Union, why they won the war? They're saying they won the war because they relied on traditional Russian patriotism. And this proves that communism has no actual appeal. It has no mobilizational potential whatsoever. The Bolsheviks or Stalin during the war had to rely on these pre-revolutionary figures. So you see, in the context of the Cold War, this geopolitical lens, it was a liability to celebrate the Russian features of the war, or that it had some connection back 1,000 years to previous Russian victories. This was a liability specifically in the context of the Cold War, and it actually played into Nikolay. You mentioned Hiroaki. You mentioned, for example, that there's the Soviet ideal, but was this just a mask for what was essentially a kind of Russian empire? Well, guess who was making that argument? American Soviet scholars and historians in the 1970s saying that this is a mask for what is essentially Russian imperialism. So what I try to show in my book is that the Soviets were extremely sensitive to those accusations. So they went out of their way to, by the 1960s, I should say by the late 1950s already, they went out of their way to back away from this Russo-centric narrative of the war. They siloed it in other areas. In 1965, for example, the Preservation Society dedicated to Russian history and culture and things like this emerges, and so on, and in other celebrations of pre-revolutionary events. The war, though, changes, right? And what I argue is a big part of that is because saying that, oh, it was the Russians who did it, did not play very well in the ideological conflict that was the Cold War. And just to address something Nikolay said, that you're right, the war has been nationalized today. This is, I would say, one of Putin's big projects. And I don't have the quote pulled up, but he has a great line where he's saying, what we need to do is link the most heroic aspects of the Soviet period, which obviously mean the World War II victory. We need to link those with 1,000 years of Russian history. So it's been this project of linking the war to this longer historical narrative. Now, why is he struggling to make this linkage at all? Because the Soviets severed that link, and they enforced the kind of separation between these two. They compartmentalized these two things. But I totally agree with you that Putin's whole objective now is to nationalize the war, link it up with past Russian heroism, and so on.
Professor Koposov, you?
Well, actually, let me mention only one thing, which is, I guess, relevant to our discussion. I totally agree, of course, that what is happening now with this cult of the Second World War is that this image of the war, this cult, has been already nationalized. But let me also attract your attention to the fact that the concept that Putin primarily uses today to refer to the adversary is Nazism rather than fascism. And this is also a kind of counterpart of the nationalization of the war in post-Soviet imagination, because fascism is, of course, a broader concept. But fascism is a kind of general name, while Nazism is far closer to a proper name, to an individual name of a historical phenomenon or concrete installation of things in Germany in the 1930s. And for Putin, using the concept of fascism would be even a little risky, because his own favorite philosopher, Ilyin, is a little bit fascist as well. And we can easily argue that there is a strong fascist tradition of semi-fascist or neo-fascist or whatever in Russia itself. So the position of Russia, not the Soviet Union, but Russia and fascism, is not a very obvious, not a very clear position. For the Soviets, this position worked very well because fascism, from their perspective, was, as you said, a kind of extreme form of imperialism, of capitalism, the most reactionary forces of all that old world and so on. And that was in opposition, obvious opposition to the forward-looking communism of Soviet Union and so on, right? But Putin doesn't like communism at all. So for him, a more concrete historical concept of Nazism is far more practically usable, because Nazism is in opposition to Russia, Stalinist Russia, or Russia, whatever, while fascism is not so good as an opposition to Russia. So it's also a kind of aspect of this nationalization of the war phenomenon.
No, thank you. Yes, it's like quote, we have 15 minutes or so. Shall we? I have other topics for discussion, or shall we go on to accept questions from the audience? Let's accept questions from the audience, and if we have time, we can go on to, I have other suggestions for discussion. So there are two questions so far. One comes from John Holmes. What part did the eastward expansion of NATO and the EU play in provoking the war in Ukraine, or giving Putin an excuse or reason?
Here, I could try that one. There's much debate about how this is very much a chimera simply an excuse that's Putin's put forward to achieve his deep aims in Ukraine. That might be the case, but I think it's important to understand in a broader historical perspective that, Russian leaders, not just Putin and part of the regime, have been talking about their concerns about NATO eastward expansion for 30 years. So from that perspective, it's a longer problem. But we should go, if I could give you two historical moments to help understand this question, perhaps. 1945, 1946, the Soviets are fighting a massive insurgency in Western Ukraine that is fueled primarily by people who would identify as fascists, who would identify as, Ukrainian nationalists in their tens of thousands in a terrible insurgency where civilians are caught in the middle between people who are fighting to continue as they did in the war to create a Ukrainian state, the Soviets that are fighting to restore control, and tens of thousands who is being squeezed between them. Now, this is a terrible part of history, but it's one that's prescient in contemporary thinking, not only on the Russian side. In 2014, it was my great privilege to be in Ukraine and Russia around 2014 and 2015, around Maidan. You have the narrative in Russia that it's saying that this is a Western-inspired coup against a legitimately elected leader in Yanukovych, and that and this is again using Ukraine, NATO, EU, using Ukraine as a base against Russia in the same way that Western powers supposedly had used it in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and the Cold War. The Germans had used it in the Second World War. The Poles were using it in the 20s. So these are the historical lines, and they're not straight, as Jonathan says, they're zigzag, that are being discussed in places like Russia and then in return in discussion in Ukraine. So, you could provide an objective analysis of what NATO is doing, and you could say one way or another what you think, what security threats it poses to Russia, so forth and vice versa. But for the people who are making these decisions in the regime, they've been talking about this concern for a long time. And I don't think that they're simply creating it as a potential excuse to cover their behavior. I think it certainly acts that way, but it's for them a legitimate concern that, filters their reality. So, I think it's an important point. And then that leads to the question of what does the West do now in supporting Ukraine to defend itself against a Russian invasion that's not making a significant distinction between civilians and military objects. Where I did my field work in just west of Borodyanka, I talked to my people there, and the villages are in ruins. And the only military objective of these villages is that they're on the way from one place to another. Now, how many other situations like that would be evident in Ukraine as we speak?
May I add something to that? Yeah, I personally think that all those security considerations have not even a grain of truth in them. It's just totally fabricated, totally invented story, because NATO is no threat to Russia and would never be a threat to Russia, except for if Russia wants to attack first. In case Russia wants to attack first, yes, of course, a NATO battalion in Estonia is something which Russians would prefer not to have. But otherwise, if Russia does not, conceive itself as an aggressor, position itself as an aggressor, the NATO movement towards the east is no threat at all. So it all depends on the interpretation and on who interprets. And in our case, a very aggressive government of a very aggressive, traditionally aggressive country interprets that in a way, once again, which completely ignores any kind of objective, serious, whatever, neutral circumstances.
Jonathan, do you have
I'll just add. I for one kind of thought the issue of NATO was a serious security concern from Russia's perspective, and I just maybe it's been exaggerated. Obviously, it has the threat posed by NATO, but I would say that it is a legitimate security concern from Russia's perspective, in my opinion. And I think what would the United States do if, I don't know, one of its neighbors joined a Russian-led military alliance? Even if we don't have aggressive military intent, so we say, I think we the United States at least would still consider that a legitimate security concern.
Yeah, in the case of the United States, I would totally agree with you, because there is no likelihood that any kind of peaceful country would try to create military bases or whatever nearby the United States. It's only an aggressor that could do that, while NATO is no aggressor. And when NATO moves somewhere, it's no danger for those countries which are around where it moves, right? It's not a completely, mirror situation. Russia and America cannot be judged by the same standards. It simply doesn't work because these are two very different countries.
Okay, we have disagreements, but that's quite okay. I'd like to go on to the second question by Olga Velikanova. Why did the official version of memory history find so powerful resonance in society? Eyewitnesses, veterans, gulag prisoners, etc. accepted myths. Why? What features of political culture made society so receptive? It's not clear whether Olga is discussing about Russia or Ukraine or both. But anyway, anyone?
I think it, for one at least, in speaking of the myth of World War II or the Great Patriotic War, I think it has such resonance, partly because it's a dramatic story. It has a narrative arc. What began as a sort of disaster from the Soviet perspective in June 1941 turned into this great triumph, and it elevated this country to superpower status. I kind of think this narrative arc has a very, very appealing quality to it, like most war myths do in other societies. Americans too grab onto our myth of World War II. We have our own version of it. The British have the myth of the Blitz, and so on. I think these are just compelling human dramas, and structured as myths, so people can read meaning into them. It gives societies meaning and direction, and I think that's why these war myths, especially from the ancient world on, have such resonance among highly diverse populations.
Thank you. Somewhat related question from Robert Kasha. Judging from Russian state media propaganda, says Kremlin's true objective seems to be de-Ukrainization rather than denazification. They even question the existence of Ukrainian language. Could this be true?
It's funny, the de-Ukrainization, the big debate for 20 or 30 years in the beginning of the Soviet Union was whether or not Euchronization was going too far. By Euchronization, we mean, I guess, in each of the republics, whatever they were called, the desire, which was supported by the Soviets in the 1920s, and the policy to revive national cultures and languages. And that's an important question to revive. Ukrainian language as a separate and distinct language was recognized by leading Russian intellectuals in the 19th century as a distinct language of its own origins. So that's not really sort of the question, but the interesting issue of de-Ukrainization, that's always been a fundamental concern among certain Soviet leaders. What to do because Euchronization taken too far leads to Ukrainian nationalism, which is dangerous. This is the argument. So I need to bring it back. And if Putin does this or understands this in the Donbass, if they establish some sort of, next territory there, like they did with Crimea, who knows what exactly the plans are. But certainly it's not just the Russians who are de-Ukrainizing, it's the Ukrainians that de-Russify. If you look at Ukrainian history from independence, different Ukrainian governments have pursued contradictory language policies, which are always big and debated. When one government takes over, They institute one language law that says you can't speak Russian here or you must speak Ukrainian, and vice versa. And this had been going on in the early 20s and 30s in the Soviet Union as well, as we went back and forward between these different language and identity policies. So it's continuing, but I think we've been speaking a lot about Russia and a little bit less about Ukraine since independence, and particularly since Maidan in 2014. We had a Poroshenko government that clearly and openly took up some of the previous or Yushchenko governments from the noughties policies about venerating exactly the people whom Putin considers to be arch enemies of the Soviet Union. You know, the Ukrainian nationalists who were fighting against them as Ukrainian heroes and decommunizing, de-Russifying areas as well. So in the more recent history, from the Russian perspective, it's a tit for tat with the Ukrainians about memory laws, and Nikolay could speak about this at length. So you know, it's part of a broader engagement over many years, rather than simply them saying, I mean, the Russians dictating about de-Ukrainizing one area or another.
And there was also a term de-Europeanization, which was used by Medvedev or somebody like that, right? Which means that what Russians want to do is non-Russification or something like that of Ukraine. Whatever is non-Russian should be expelled from Ukraine. Whether you define this non-Russianness as Ukrainianness or Westernness or Europeanness or whatever, they should be ours. That's the message.
All right, there is another question. We are short of time. From Goibud. We've been talking about Soviet legacy, but part of Ukrainian territory spent at least part of the 20th century as parts of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Could the panelists comment on the legacy of this aspect to the Russian-Ukrainian relationship? In other words, what we call the western part of Ukraine, or some of which are Polish territory, Czech territory, and Romanian territory. Their experience was certainly different from Soviet Union part, at least until 1939 or 45. Is there any impact of this difference on today's Ukraine?
I'll just, so Philip, I'm sure you can answer this question better than I could, but I'll just say this kind of ties into a point you were making earlier about how Ukraine was always maybe viewed with some suspicion as a kind of potential base for hostile infiltration of the Soviet Union or whatever. And in my opinion, I think a lot of it does date to this, the fact that you know, the western part of Ukraine had belonged to another state, you know, but before 1945, and therefore was perhaps that part of the country, the republic at least, was susceptible to foreign influence and so on. I wonder what you would think of that.
Yeah, historically these regions, and we talk about you know, well, the Kresy would say that the regions there between Poland and Ukraine had been contested for centuries among different empires, Polish-Lithuanian empires, the Austrians, the Russians, and so forth. And so their influence was very much different, and their historical trajectories were slightly different than further east in Ukraine. It's probably only 1940 that these areas come under Soviet control. And then again in 44, 45. And it's on these sites that we have the massive insurgency and counterinsurgency that continues into the early 1950s. It's primarily here. It's nowhere else in Ukraine really that it takes place. And that's, you know, I would suggest, you know, Soviet and then a continued Russian imagination. It's these areas that provide, you know, as we said, the basis for danger and potential action. When, you know, Russian media talks about the, you know, nationalist fascist or Nazis bases, they're talking primarily about, you know, Lviv, these areas that come over here. And I think it's problematic in the sense that Russian media tends to extrapolate that experience from West Ukraine onto all of Ukraine. To say, like, oh look, there's nationalists here, we found a fascist or something, then the whole country is like that, which is very different, I guess, to the Soviet experience that tried to minimalize after the Second World War the collaborations and the relationships between Ukrainians and Germans and then others, to highlight the great support and the greatness of Ukrainian contribution to Soviet victory. So it seems as if it happens in reverse now in terms of the media.
Thank you very much.
Let me just add my voice to Hiroaki's. Thank you so much to everybody who attended. Thank you for all of your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to answer yours. Thank you especially to all of our speakers, to Jonathan, Filip, Nikolay, and to Hiroaki, who has chaired everything so admirably. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion full of really amazing insights into what Nikolay described, I think, as the zigzags of Ukrainian, Russian, and Soviet history. So thank you all very much. And I wish you all the very best with the rest of your days. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, guys, everyone.